Hey, welcome to week 3, lecture 2. This is lecture 8 overall. In the last lecture, looking at the diagram that I shared, we explored some of the misnomers about cultural relevance and why our best intentioned efforts often fall short. This lecture, I want to turn our attention to the idea of cultural congruence. Congruence means to be in harmony with something. This is precisely why cross-culture engagement can feel so difficult, intimidating to so many people. Cross-cultural engagement is an act of vulnerability in which one is challenged to step outside of what is oftentimes our even when we don't realize it, our insulary cultural mindsets, and into a world in which what we fear will be that where there will be little congruence or harmony at all. It could feel awkward or weird. We could feel like an outsider. It positions one in the vulnerability of feeling ridiculous or as though others might be secretly laughing at them. Many will resist engagement with the other because their fear of non-congruence has already set up an insecure defensive posture. Now, let's face it, we've all been in situations in which we felt woefully out of place. Our outsider status was apparent in our conduct, in the assumptions that we made, in our seeming inability to navigate even the most mundane of relationships and conversations. I have a white male friend who grew up in the governmental housing of East St. Louis, who had been shaped by a cultural context that, despite his minority status in a predominantly black setting, had left him with a certain worldview and values system and cultural expressions with which he was comfortable. When he moved north to a city that was 98.7% white, his first thought was, where are all the black people? His second thought was, I don't like this. So even though his skin color represented the majority in this new community, given his cultural background, he had little to no congruence with the new setting, which made him feel deeply defensive and vulnerable, often leading to increased amounts of conflict. Cultural congruence is often what is lacked when a person steps into a particular cultural's context. Let me say that again. Cultural congruence is often what is lacked when a person steps into a cross-cultural context. So what is cultural congruence? Cultural congruence is the unconscious alignment of a person to a particular context's worldviews, values, and external expressions. Cultural congruence means our non-reflective capacity to fit in. It's unquestioned. It's just who we are. Cultural congruence is in many ways the way of the insider. It's what the insider experiences when the whole of their life has been shaped by a set of influences and didactic processes that has taught them to exist in the world in a certain way. One doesn't try to believe, act, dress, or eat a certain way. It runs down to the core of who they are. It's in them, oftentimes unconsciously and non-reflectively so. I used to make the joke when I lived in the South that when a boy was born in the South, they dressed them in camo diapers, handed them keys to a truck, taught them how to shoot, and then tattooed the number of their favorite NASCAR driver on their arm. Now, this is the kind of joke that an uncomfortable outsider makes in light of the realization that the outsider doesn't fit in. There's a lack of congruence. Having had a set of life experiences that exposed me to difference in a number of ways, I had to often be reminded that the contrary positions that many of my friends who had lived, grown up, and never left portions of the South weren't out of spite, but because of the cultural congruence with a worldview and set of values that had shaped them. One that had not informed me at the same degree, and one that had often left me feeling exposed, in a minority, and vulnerable to misunderstanding. And ministerially speaking, there are some pros and cons to cultural congruence, and I want to explore those. So first, let's look at the pros. The pros of cultural congruence are that a person indigenous to a cultural context already has an understanding of the people being reached and ministered to. They already fit in, and in many ways, their congruence has given them or afforded them a bit of street cred. And speaking with a new friend who had come from the biker culture, which is a very real culture, and honestly, it's a fairly exclusivist culture. I assured him that he was positioned much better to reach those he rides with than I was. And he laughed, knowing my propensity for fancy coffee drinks, classic music, and my love for books. He agreed wholeheartedly. He had already been given credibility and been shaped by a framework and values that the community as a whole shared. This is why I believe one of the greatest acts of ministry leadership in any context is the empowerment and development of indigenous leaders. Their congruence helps to avoid a distance that can become a bind to the gospel. Now, if and this is one of the cons. The problem with this is if they aren't so non. Let me say this again. One of the cons is that oftentimes we are so non-reflective of the culture in which we are congruent that we miss the points in which our worldviews, values, and behaviors are out of line with the demands of the gospel and the call to follow Jesus. Congruence can make us blind to the problems and systemic unfaithfulness to the kingdom of God. To recognize cultural congruence in ministry is also to take seriously the countercultural call of the gospel, which oftentimes puts us at a critical distance with our own cultural context to ensure that our immersion in a people doesn't miss the holy call to come up out of the sinful worldviews or non-kingdom values of the people. So for instance, my biker friend would need to recognize that within the biker culture, this hardened culture that he was immersed, that there's often a way of treating women as their old ladies. And in biker culture, to be an old lady is often to mean that you are a form of property. However, the countercultural call of the gospel would need to challenge his assumptions and the worldviews in which he had been brought up and raised and reform his view of a man's relationship with a woman. Likewise, I often meet too many American pastors that have failed to recognize the cultural distance needed for second-order critical reflection, especially of one's own cultural congruence. I often say to many of my American pastor friends and to lay people, the problem with American Christianity is that it's just too American to be Christian. What I mean by that is that our congruence with a worldview that emphasizes rugged individuality and volunteer association, national superiority, and a propensity towards militarism and violence makes it difficult to understand life within the socially embedded context of the people of God, who are international in their reach and are called to be peacemakers. Cultural congruence is good in that it creates opportunities in which the water is already shared between those ministering and those being reached. It's problematic when it's so non-reflectively embedded in a person's being that they're unable to question the points at which their culture is out of sync with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Cultural congruence is often the uncritical, unconscious embodiment of cultural norms, worldviews, values, behaviors, and stories. It's the harmony that comes with a person's insider status. It's what makes the chasm feel so threatening and vulnerable. Inherently, most people doing ministry recognize that cultural congruence will be difficult. That's why cultural shock and cultural fatigue are very real things among missionaries, especially if one's not fluent in the language. Language is absolutely necessary for cultural congruence. And as Livermore notes, culture is transmitted most often and most deeply in semiotic syntax and the semantics of a language. And one might even ask the question, can one be considered culturally congruent until they've actually dreamt in the language of the culture being reached? And even then, one has to be aware of some of the distance that still exists between the cross-cultural chasm that is being bridged. So we started with the sort of misnomers of cultural relevance, and this lecture has looked at the idea of cultural congruence and what it means to be culturally congruent. The next lecture we're going to look at will deal with cultural fluency, which is what I believe can be hoped for among those of us that are doing ministry in many of the contexts that we find ourselves. If you're watching this on Tuesday, this third lecture will be posted a little bit later on this afternoon into the evening. So watch these first two lectures and reflect on those, and then I'll post the third lecture a little bit later.